Did it work?
It works.
Oh my God.
Yay, yippee. Thank you so much for being here, Alok, and taking time out for joining and talking to our community.
Happy to be here.
Brilliant. As always, uh, uh, we are very interested in knowing about your professional journey. So maybe you can start with your professional journey. How did you become interested in entrepreneurship? What have you been doing before Appjobs? And then we come to the core points.
All right. So I think that it's always difficult to know where an entrepreneurial journey starts. So I grew up in a neighborhood that in an immigrant neighborhood where there was quite a lot of unemployment,
Hmm.
and not only quite a lot of unemployment, but also quite limited views on what you can achieve and do in life.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I think that pretty early on, I wanted to explore myself, apart from being a taxi driver or a pizza place owner,
Hmm. Hmm.
what's out there. Um, and I thought that the I thought that the solution was to become a boss, and I
Okay.
didn't really have a very clear view of what that meant, but some sort of manager. And I
Hmm.
think
Hmm.
that was that was probably defining for the start of my professional journey, because then then I started studying finance, and then I became a management consultant, and then I did that for 5 years with the Boston Consulting Group. And I at some point I lived in California when I was working at BCG, and I saw all these people that didn't have to wear suits and
Hmm.
still were doing interesting things. And apparently they were doing something called startups. And I said, well, I don't want to wear a suit either. And I want to do this. And so, and at the same time, I had this risk averse mindset that you get when you're a management consultant, where
Hmm.
you want to pretend that you take risk, but you don't really want to take risk, especially not reputational risk of failing and so on.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
my way of then going into the startup world was to join Uber. And so I was the general manager of Uber in Sweden, which, I mean, it was a startup, but it was 5,000 people. So for me personally, not very much risk, right? And so I think that's I don't know if I'm too open now, but I feel like this conversation is like a mix of a therapy session an interview and a first date. So I'll just that's I just lay it out there. That's me.
That's absolutely amazing, and I think I love it. You talked about being in an immigrant neighborhood. I'll like to go deep into that in
Hmm.
a little while. But then there are inflection points in your career. So when you had the idea of being a boss, and then you figured out bots didn't mean a suit, and you wanted to be a different kind of boss. So that's really great. And then you talked about the reputational risk, right? Which, of course, the more you go into the corporate sector, the greater is the difficulty for you to plunge out of that corporate kind of a fixed boxed role. So I think that's really good. But before we go into the startup journey, app jobs, and the specifics of the startup, I'm very curious in knowing about the immigrant neighborhoods, because when I came to Sweden, we also had an immigrant neighborhood. We didn't I was not directly into that neighborhood. Uh, but neighborhood is also more like an ecosystem. Like when we talk about startup ecosystem, it's like ecosystem. See, so what I figured from your story is that um a neighborhood which is not aligned with value is still good, because you end up doing something which is not the same ecosystem. So you can develop a very different perspective out of the same ecosystem, while some people might be aligned with the ecosystem.
I
What?
think I think it might be even better than that. I think it might be a catalyst. I
Mm-hmm.
actually I actually spoke to I went to a therapist once who tried to explain to me that I wasn't as star spangled awesome as I thought. And because I've always had, or not always, but I at that specific session I had this idea about, I'm very good at thinking outside the box and whatnot. And she tried to explain to me that, well, you might be good at thinking outside the box, but that's not some innate talent that you have. That's actually the product of you
Mm-hmm.
growing up in a specific type of circumstance, which was so my mother is from India, And my dad is originally Swedish but lived in India most of his life, and he's quite left leaning. And then I grew up in this immigrant neighborhood, but my mother put me in school with all the rich kids on the other side of town early on. So from a very young age, from like 9-10 years old, I basically lived in like 4 different norms systems in parallel, right? I mean, I had, the Indian culture, my dad's views and norms, and then the neighborhood that I lived in, and then the school that I went to, and in each of these siloed ecosystems, there was a perception of reality that was obvious for everyone in that ecosystem, but they weren't compatible with each other. And I think that in me formed it spurred a view or an understanding that reality is what we make of it. I mean, it's like everything that we see, every product, every building, but also every rule, every law, everything is just man-made. I mean, nothing is from above. Everything is just man-made. And not only is it man-made, everything is man-made in the past. Whether it was 50 years ago a bridge was built, or 5 minutes ago a cake was made, it's from the past, which also means that since time goes forward, circumstances change, which means by just pure logic that it's possible to change things and improve them. It must be so, right? So I think all of that sort of came into this stew, and I think that's a little bit where this comes from.
No, this is amazing. I think when you talk about being in 4 siloed ecosystems, that's a great experience. Of course, it can be very confusing as well. So you kind of have to switch mode. In my personal life, we have traveled a lot. So I was discussing it with my partner here and with kids, that we have shifted like the base home 8 times in the last 18 years or so, something. But that's also prepared us well for doing the 9th time, I think, because the experiences of switch that's something that's a big debate in entrepreneurship. Let's touch on that, because the corporate sector wants you to specialize, because it'll reward you for being as deeply specialized as you go over your life. So you go from a developer to a senior developer to a CTO, eventually to a tech head of the company. So you kind of narrow yourself up. As opposed to entrepreneurship, more recent research now suggests the more generalist you are. Like if you can see things laterally, that's a huge contributor to success. Do you agree? Or
yeah, I mean, I also think that this forms a little bit the misinformed self impression that a lot of corporate, especially young people, have, and I was one of them. I mean, when I was a management consultant, I remember actually a date that I had with a girl who was going to be a singer, or she was a singer. She was a famous artist, and this was just when I had joined this big management consulting company. And she was very proud of herself, but I was so full of myself that I was like, yeah, I also sing in the shower, but let me tell you about how awesome I am, and how important I am, and so on and so forth. And while I was only 24, 25. And I think that the reason why I was able to be that awesome, quote unquote, as a consultant or as a corporate, person, is because so many variables were fixed, right? So it's in a very tiny spectrum, or part of the spectrum of life, that I had to perform and develop. Everything else was fixed and given to me, and it's essentially the same as working at McDonald's. I mean, how can a 24-year-old or even a 22-year-old become a manager at McDonald's, but no 22-year-old or very few 22-year-old can even start a pretty poor pizzeria? Well, it's because it's a franchise concept, right? There's everything is decided. It's a very small, narrow band in which you need to perform. So I think that very much is the difference. That very much becomes the shock as well when corporate people then try to enter into the entrepreneurship type of mode, because and I remember that. I mean, you just assume that things are sort of fixed for you. I mean, even when I started Uber and I had my first day at Uber, I was like, so so where do I get my phone? And they were like, what do you mean? Well, my phone. And they were like, you don't have a phone? It's like, yes, but my work phone. And I'm like, well, but you can call with your phone, can't you? I mean, you called me up when you were coming up in the door. And I was like, well, but I mean, what if I do work calls? And they were like, well, what kind of plan do you have for your phone? Isn't it a flat fee plan? That's what everyone has. And I was like, well, yeah. And they were like, well, then you don't pay extra for the work calls, right? And I was like, well, what if I want to call abroad? And they're like, why would you call abroad? You know, there's WhatsApp. I mean, it was just like I had this mind that, you know, when you started a company, they give you a phone.
Yeah.
And they're like, well, sort out your damn phone.
It's a norm. So I think that's where BlackBerry developed their niche and eventually flopped because it couldn't keep up with that kind of thing. But great points over there. And if we kind of jump a little bit deeper into, so what we are discussing over here is that one of the reasons why corporate, and we see that happening, like corporate, like it's an age of great resignation that we are saying after COVID and everything. People are like kind of questioning why a fixed boxed role, why can't I do something different with my life? So human beings, I think, have a huge internal desire for freedom. So that's why we love peace, even if some of us don't say that openly. But we love peace. We want creative expression. We want to connect with others because that's an internal desire to, just like a plant, you want to grow. That's a natural progression. So then entrepreneurship, something which I've also noticed in early stage advisory is that traditional advisory organizations, Sweden and outside, they try to ask entrepreneurs to develop 5-year plans. They are just figuring out their idea, but we want them to have a very clear financial projection for the 5 years. I don't know. Do you agree or not agree? Like if you are very early stage, can you actually see 5 years in advance? Like a bank would always push you there.
I remember the first, like when we started Appjobs, and I know we will talk more about Appjobs later, but when we first started, like 2 months in or something, we just started. I think we had barely built like the first prototype. It was more like PowerPoint stage or something like that. And then I was at this, I think it was a Sting day where, you know, investors can come and mingle. And we were showing, you know, what we're building and so on. And there was a Ukrainian woman, an investor, who came and she started pressing me on different KPIs and whatnot. And I said, well, look, you know, we're you know, we're barely started. You know, this is, if you would want to invest in this, it's more of investing in you know, us as people and ideas. And she was like, well, you need to show me numbers. I mean, you need to show me numbers. And at the end of and she was pressing me so hard. So after a while, I was like, of course I can give you numbers. Like, what number do you want? 10, 100, 10 million? I mean, I have a lot of numbers. What do they mean? I mean, at this stage, what do they mean for you, apart from giving you some psychological safety that I'm able to write some numbers into a spreadsheet? Like, none of this is true at this point. So, I mean, I think that if it's about sort of checking if the entrepreneur has the ability to think in numbers, well, then that makes sense. But if it's supposed to be some sort of crystal ball about what the future actually looks like, which you sometimes get a future from investors.
I think financial sector is still very much in the old box of making uncertain things certain. So you want to commit, like this is the certainty coefficient here, and by this level of probability this will happen because you're dealing with money. And I think that pushes the financial sector to ask startups to commit. Like, can you? Because then if you ask somebody to commit, you can always go back and say you committed on this.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and now this is not happening. Yeah,
I have a startup friend, or a CEO, Samantha, who she calls this certainty theater.
Okay.
It's like a theater. It's like a show of certainty, and people, you know, they like to live in that. But I don't know. I think that if we can allow ourselves to be vulnerable enough to see realities as it is, that is, I think at least that will be more productive. I think a lot of this is just psychological anxiety. You know? I mean, mind you, this hopefully this doesn't offend too many people, but I mean, most people. I studied with these guys, like who are in the financial sector, right? And they're the most risk averse people that go. The mix is. Such a weird mix when startup people and entrepreneurs meet like financial people, and you try to bridging that
Yeah.
is difficult.
Okay, that's really, really very interesting. So, if we kind of try to, so Alok of 5 years who worked in management consulting versus Alok who is in entrepreneurship, which side is happy? Just
I mean, well, that's such an easy answer. I mean, this is it's there is no comparison, and
okay.
that is not to say that my time as a management consultant wasn't very rewarding. It was. I mean, it was very rewarding in terms of learning how to think, structuring problems, doing storyline. I mean, it was like going to school and learning things. But in terms of making a dent on the world and trying, and trying what you can create with your own hands or something. I don't know how to describe it, but there's no comparison.
Okay. So again, we're back to the freedom of expression, the power of creation, which
Yeah.
I think the normal work life is getting more and more difficult with role specialization and whatever the job availabilities. That's a great point to start. Let's talk about your startup
Mhm.
and what problem are you trying to solve with it? Yeah.
Well, so
What's the big idea?
yeah, well, exactly. So let's start with where this came from first. So I told you I was a management consultant, then I wanted to do something startup-y, and I was like, okay, what is sort of a good risk reward type of mix for me? And I've always been very interested in the sort of future of work in the labor market, and this comes from where I grew up. So so I found this company back then called Uber that I wasn't attracted by their taxi business side of things, the consumer side of the things, and that Uber app. But there's another Uber app, which is the Uber app for drivers. And I was very intrigued by the fact that there's a company who has created an app that you can download, and then it instructs you to do things, and you can make money from those instructions. So it's almost like streaming work, right? And this was back in like 2013, 2014. And I felt like I want to work with that. So that's why I joined Uber, and that's so it was the labor side of things, like organizing labor through these type of digital tools instead of through corporations. Now, since then, this has become called the gig economy, and it's growing, and everyone knows it. And what I saw back then is like, okay, this is a paradigm shift, similar to the Industrial Revolution. And when those happens, there's a lot of problems that are created. And even though output and productivity and total value increases, it's skewed in how that value is captured by different market participants. Specifically in this case, workers and gig workers are getting the short end of the stick.
Yeah.
So I wanted to create a company that helps create a better future for gig workers, and doing that by helping them work better through apps, and make more money. Essentially, the business idea that I wanted to have is, if we can make gig workers make more money, then we make more money. Like, if we can create that type of dynamic, that's what I want to do. And well, then you can ask, well, but there's a lot of labor rights organizations and whatnot out there that are supposed to protect labor. Well, there are, but they're not really on point when it comes to this. So unions, for example, who are traditionally pro-labor, they're not pro-labor, they're pro-employees, right? They derive their strength from the employee-employer relationship. I mean, their strength is to go on strike, which doesn't work in a gig economy type ecosystem. So unions aren't and I mean, some of them are trying, but unions aren't really the solution. And collective bargaining agreements don't really work in this type of environment and so on. Political parties in Europe and the Western world are their ideologies are very based on 19th century ideological analysis, which also doesn't fit here. In the Eastern world, or in the developing world, politics is driven by completely other things. So then you have civil society, which is struggling to wrap their head around this, NGOs and stuff. And then you have industry. And industry, most of industry, when we started Appjobs 4 years ago, was still, it's the gig economy was still so early that most of it was creating gig platforms, not supporting workers. So I felt like there's a white space here. There's a very big need and a very big problem for these people to get financial security, financial inclusion, to have someone in their corner, championing their interests. I'm not talking about their rights. I'm talking about interests, and that's where we started.
But that's something very interesting you talk about, because you went from the big idea to the actual structures which this idea needs to bring down, like the union structure. Of course, it's a product of a time of fixed employment contracts where labor is a large chunk and they're large corporations as on fixed arrangements. At the same time, you're also talking about the political side, which is also stuck in, of course. So I think the support structure for new ideas doesn't necessarily evolve at the same rate. So these problems are going to stick around. But gig platforms, from your startup's view, how big you think is this revolution going to be? As you're saying, this is a revolution which you saw.
As big as the industrial revolution. Look, this is not a trend or something. This is an underlying technological shift. And if I bore you, let me bore you with some details.
Yeah, please.
So what this is, so actually when I studied finance, I think my first week, we got to read a paper from a guy called, I think he was called Ronald Coase. The paper was called The Nature of the Firm, and it was written in 1936 or 37. And it explores why companies exist. Why are there companies? Because we are thought to believe that the capitalist system is the greatest in the world, but capitalism means free market, and free market means that we all just exchange goods with each other. But a corporation is not free market. A corporation is planned economy. A corporation is a communist system in itself, in within the walls of the corporation, right? It's a plan. So why do those corporations exist? He was looking at, and what he found was the reason why corporations exist is because of transaction cost. Because in the open market, the transaction cost is too high for it to be truly capitalist. So in certain sizes, planned economy is needed, and that's why corporations are formed. Now, for the last 20, 30, 40 years, information technology, not only internet, but phones, air travel, all of these different things have brought down the transaction cost, which makes companies more and more specialized, and then also spurs so that you can have freelancers and whatnot. And this is just the what do you call it, the pinnacle of this. I mean, this is like the end point of this, where everyone has a computer in their pocket that is constantly updated, and also with great UX and UI and whatnot, very simply can interact with the algorithm that allocates resources, labor. So that is what's driving this. It's the decline of transaction cost for organizing labor. And where does that hit first? It hits first in capital intensive things, and that's why Airbnb and Uber was first out.
Yeah.
Right? Real estate and cars, and a broken system of taxi industry worldwide. But then, then that continues, and then it continues into low skilled labor, and then after a while it continues up in higher skilled labor, and so on. I think that the gig economy is something that will eat itself in as a sector in virtually all types of industries and all types of positions, maybe with the exception of senior management.
Okay, got it. And I think that's one reason why we see geographical and country level differences as well, because some countries are at a different scale of technology, and others have adopted service economies, tech economies, and others countries are able to provide cheaper development costs, cheaper labor costs. So I think those are ecosystem level, like geographical level, block level differences. But this is really interesting to hear your perspective. How exactly does your product solve the problem for the gig workers? Like there are so many gig platforms out there, and
Yeah.
so
Okay.
how would you say, how have you positioned yourself to be unique in this market?
So in three ways. So the overall thing here is we want to help people work better through apps, to build a better future for gig workers, and we want to do that along the journey, their gig economy journey or the gig work journey. So and that consists of a few different points. The first point is, which gig platform should I work with? Like which ones match me in my city? And this is in plural. It's not in singular. It's not which one. It's which ones, right?
Okay.
Because you can multi-app. So that you do on appjobs.com. You go to appjobs.com, and so that's our product for matching you to the gig platforms, reviewing, comparing, and so on. Then when you're actually working with gig platforms, let's say that you're driving with Uber, Bolt, and someone else, Hitch. Then the next question is, how do I optimize my work? These gig platforms are gaming you. They have their algorithms, and they're sending out their different incentives and whatnot. They're trying to game you against all the other gig workers. How do you gig them against each other, right? So we help you do that. So the next part of the journey is to increase your productivity and to help you gain them, and you do that through Appjobs Work. Appjobs Work is an app that you download. You connect your different gig accounts to that, and then we crunch the data with our algorithms, fighting for you, battling with the algorithms of the gig platforms, fighting for them, right? And so we call it multi-app like a boss, right? That's what we help you do. So we help you multi-app like a boss, and I'll come back to that because this is very interesting when it comes to unions and whatnot, and political stuff as well. And then the third thing that we found in the gig worker journey is that gig workers outside of their work are not treated equally in society compared to all the other people. They don't have the same financial inclusion. They don't have the same access to credit. They don't have the same access to insurance. They're basically not they don't fit into structure. So the third part of this is to help gig workers in their life to get the type of inclusion in society and finance. Finance is a big part of a society. That that normal people or other people, traditional workers like you and me, have. And we do that part with a data sharing platform called unveil.io. So the first one is matching to work. That's appjobs.com. The second one is improving your work. That's appjobs.work. And the third one is a data sharing platform that we call unveil.io. So those are the three things. And if I can take 30 seconds more to...
please go ahead. It's your time.
The second part of this, improving your work and gaming the platforms against each other, there we have found how other pro-labor players in the market are slightly confused or misguided. So, for example, we see in our data that the biggest earnings contributor, the biggest factor or variable that gets you to earn more money as a gig worker is your ability to multi-app. Right? Because then you can you can optimize the productivity, you can game the platforms against each other. However, the main political force in Europe primarily, but also partly in North America, not at all in Asia, by the way, is to reassign all of these people as employees to the gig platforms. And this is championed by unions as well. The problem with this is that this limits the people from multi-apping. So when this was done in Spain earlier this year, for example, people were initially happy, but because they thought that they were getting more protection. But what ends up happening is that people lose 20 to 30% of their earnings. And so this is where I mean that, and I'm not anti-union or anti-political parties, by the way. I mean, I'm all for it, but I think that there's a lot of need for a lot of traditional players to understand that the dynamic has shifted, and they need to come up with solutions that fits this type of dynamic and not the old type of dynamic, because the old tools, they actually hamper value or restrict value creation in this new world.
Yeah, I think you brought up a very interesting point, because we see that happening in any forward moving industry. Like even when we had Voy with us, the scooters company here, like three to 4 months ago, and what they are building is ahead of time. The transportation laws and how cities are configured is based on old infrastructure, but now there's a discussion of 15-minute cities. How do you actually create, because you as a startup can create technology at a much faster pace, while ecosystem doesn't have the same pace. It has to go through the same political approval processes, building configurations. I think the challenges that you are facing in this market are real. Then they'll probably stick around while you're building your own innovation. So I think, but I like the word, because in all these concepts, the word that caught my attention over here, one which you mentioned early on, the boss word, which comes from your own initial background when you mentioned it. But multi-app, tell me, what is multi-app? Like, how can one person multi-app? Because that's a very interesting term that I've heard. Yeah.
No, so multi-app, I mean, that's the embodiment, I would say, of gig work and gig economy. It's like, it's that you are acting in a almost frictionless market. By the way, this might sound like a new term to people, but and everyone listening who's on Tinder knows exactly what I'm talking about. I mean, that, there was this thing called marriage a couple of decades ago. People stick together for 20, 30 years with one person. And then, in the 90s, people started dating, and, they had they had the sequential dates. But now with Tinder and whatnot, people are multi-dating multiple people at the same time. And there are all kinds of issues with that. But why is that? Well, that is because the dating market has had a declining transaction cost in finding a new mate. And with Tinder, that transaction cost in finding a new mate is essentially down to almost zero, which means that it opens up this possibility to multi-date. And it's the same thing that's happening in the labor market. The transaction costs are going down so much that you can log into one platform now, let's say Uber, and you can drive someone to one place, and then you can log off and log in and be online with Bolt, and then you can do the Bolt. So within a space of 5 to 10 minutes, you can have worked with 2 or 3 different platforms. And if you can game that, like if you can, when that grows, when that expands, that universe of choice, and if someone helps you, optimize that, well, then you increase your return on work. I mean, by the way, that's my dream KPI. My dream KPI for Appjobs is return on work. Like, we want to optimize your return on work. When we increase your return on work, then we make money. If we don't increase your return on work, then we shouldn't make money.
No, that's a great KPI, like return on work. But how does it work with the partners that you work with in terms of when you are gaming the platforms? Is there a friction that you face as a company? Because you have a revolutionary idea of making the return on work go up for the gig worker. How does it play with the gig service providers, the apps?
Actually, quite well, because their interest as well. I mean, first of all, their value creation, contrary to popular belief and what the news media says, their value creation does not come from exploiting people. Their value creation comes from matching supply and demand in real time. Like, that's what I did when I was at Uber. 90% of what we did, if you would go into the office, was like discussions like, okay, on Tuesdays between 2 and 3 p.m. in this part of the time, how do we increase the completed the request ratio to this, that, and the other thing? I mean, it's all about improving the liquidity and the matching and whatnot. So that's where the gig platforms derive their value from. They want to have a flexible source of supply that actually helps them. So I think that it's not as much of a controversy as one might think. They are also dependent on workers being able to have a livable wage and being happy. So Yeah, I mean,
Otherwise, it'll be odd for the long-term survival of the platform or its positioning. But I don't know. You have brought out some very interesting phraseology. I would say how you are describing things. So I love it when you say they're not here to exploit labor, but they are matching supply and demand in real time. Like that kind of narrative, I think platforms need to position. I don't see that position well in their positioning. So it's a good point that you had mentioned.
yeah.
Um, let's talk a little bit about work itself.
Hmm.
Like with the pandemic coming in and our lives switching, and like we are both sitting in our homes right now. So it feels really great doing uh, this talk, which essentially would in other uh, how would you say in other in pre pandemic period, usually an event takes around 6 hours. There is a pre-planning of events, and then there is well, it's also interesting because there's this physical networking, but it's all possible digitally as well. That's what we have learned. What have you seen as how do you see work evolving going forward, and
Yeah.
from your perspective, especially on the gig side, but generally as well, if you
I,
would want to take that.
I just 2 seconds reflection on what you just said. It used to take 6 hours and whatnot. That's the transaction cost declining for organizing
Yeah.
these types of events. So I think that, well, I mean, um, I don't know if someone will be very upset if I say. Let me first caveat and say, uh, deep sympathy with all the victims of COVID and
Mm,
all the pain that has brought. From a pure economics perspective, I believe that COVID has been very good
mm,
because it has forced the entire world to try out digital processes and tools for organizing work and labor. And
yeah.
even the most conservative CEOs in their 60s or 70s who had like their paper notes and whatnot have been forced to do Zoom calls or whatever. And I think that um, so I think that's one thing. And then I also think that it has helped open our mind to what value creation is. And I use the word value creation instead of work because although they should be synonymous, work and value creation, for
Mm,
most people, even you and I, and even the people, maybe the people listening, they're not. I think that it's so ingrained in us, especially in pre-COVID times, that work is a physical place that you go to where
mm,
you're miserable for about 8 hours with poor lighting, dry air, and these 90-minute meetings in two big conference rooms where the meetings start with, we're here to discuss, which should be a red flag for anyone to leave a meeting, right? And then people exit that at around 5:30, 6 p.m., feeling completely exhausted, as if, and that defines in their mind that they have done a day of work. That exhaustion, and that's not work. That is just being miserable.
yeah.
Work is doing something productive that creates value that wasn't there before you did it. And that's why that's why we like to think in these terms of return on work. And by the way, the gig economy makes this very, very clear. I mean, it crystallizes this, right? Because as an Uber driver, if you're not being paid per hour, right? You're being, when you drive someone, that's when you get paid. You get paid for the gig. And
Mm,
so it becomes very clear what the value creating component or task is, activity is, and that's what you're being compensated for. And I think that
mm,
also scares a lot of people because what, yeah, we should have wage by hour and whatnot. And
mhm, mhm,
it is, yeah, I mean, but that's a longer discussion. But I think a lot of this is just to get the psychological safety. I mean, if you have the self-confidence to feel like you're a productive person, you should know or realize that you will make more money when you charge for the work that you do and not for the time that you're miserable.
yeah. No, I absolutely love it. The time that you're miserable, and I think that's a it's a paradigm shift. I would say, as human beings, we love certain bit of, as you were saying, from with finance professionals, risk averse, certainty and all in our life, and that's why we stick to routines and rituals, even if we are not, like, they are part of our lives, even if we don't feel at times good about them, but we still stick to a set of routines. So I think what you're saying about work being a box where you entered, came out, with that box being the same day after day after day after day. So I think that that's a great way of looking at work. And me being, for example, I had COVID recently, have gone through the vaccinations. I completely resonate with your points that work, it doesn't need, it's not a space, it's the output, like it's the value you bring, it's what you define, that did you end up creating something which didn't exist before. So that's a great way of looking at work going forward. Let's take some questions as well. Let's see. Coming from diverse, how do you see current Okay, very interesting question here. Coming from such a diverse background, how do you see current companies dealing with diversity? Are they dealing with it enough? What kind of room is there? Yeah.
So I mean, I breezed over my sort of professional career, but I've worked in other companies than the ones I mentioned now. But almost all companies except for one of them have been American companies. So I've only worked for one traditional Swedish company, and I have to say that, like, big American companies, they're actually pretty good at this. I mean, I feel like when it comes to diversity and I mean, they're meritocratic in a very clear way. At least the ones that I've worked for, P&G, Bain, BCG, and so on. So I feel like those companies are doing quite well. Then I've worked with one Swedish company, and I don't think it was the company policy that was the problem. I think it's more like, I don't know if I should blame Swedish society, but it's so interesting when you've worked abroad and that in Sweden we have this idea. By the way, I love Sweden. I mean, I love Sweden. I love Swedish people, but it's like we're 10 million people, which is barely a district in Beijing, right? But in Sweden we still have this feeling that we're sort of the center of the world, and in Sweden we have a system that's, there's almost even a saying, right? And we would like to teach the Americans and the Chinese and whatnot on how to do things better. And sometimes there is a bit of myopia in that kind of culture and norm system. So I think that my feeling is that Swedish companies are trying to be diverse, but they just are probably quite often blind to it.
Okay, got it. Let's move to the next question. Corporations were shaped startups. You gave an example of that phone paradigm, like you were thinking that, okay, why don't we get a work phone and all? What advice would you give to corporations to pace faster or work faster like startups? Like, what are they missing?
A lot of things. I mean, but let me try to give some sort of realistic advice here. And maybe the realistic advice would be actually one thing that they could do, and that I missed when I was working for a big Swedish corporation, was that, okay, fine that you have us all boxed into all of these different processes and whatnot, but there should at least be the possibility to do things outside. I mean, what I mean by that is, fine that you mandate that I have to do this, that, and the other thing, but don't restrict me from doing other things on top of those things that you mandate. And that's by the way, I mean, I live by this a little bit in Appjobs as well. I mean, the unofficial rule that is very strong in Appjobs is like, you have to use the tools and follow the rules and instructions that your boss tells you, but you can do whatever you want. You can do whatever you want as long as you also do that, right?
Okay.
So for example, I like Zoom. So if you're going to have a meeting with me, and if I set up the meeting, I'm going to send you a Zoom link, so you have to have Zoom. But you can use Google Meets. Whenever you're doing things, you can do whatever you like, solve the thing in whatever way that you want, but then when you're interacting with me, it's the same. Like some people like Figma and other people like Miro. I mean, that's fine as long as there's some structure of keeping this together. And the structure would be that, okay, fine, that you mandate what things I took tools as an example because it's easy, but it applies to other things as well. So I would say, fine that you mandate what I have to use, but don't mandate what I can't use.
Okay, got it. So you think the work needs to have a duality, the duality, because processes are needed as you structure up, and you might have felt that, like app jobs in the first year versus app jobs in the fourth or fifth year,
Yeah.
it would be much different because early stage startups are still figuring and easy to pivot. Later stage startup needs to start delivering on certain KPIs.
Yeah.
But then you talk about that processes aside, you should still have how would you say, a place for freedom or a domain for freedom.
Exactly.
Which
So
you
I
can
think
drive.
that I'm saying that, yes, you should build a backbone. There needs to be a backbone in a big company, and also in a startup that starts maturing, you need to have a backbone. But you don't need to limit things outside of the backbone. As long as everything sticks to the backbone, I think that I think this is a hypothesis. Maybe I'm wrong, but my hypothesis would be that corporations would benefit from increasing the freedom of people experimenting outside of the backbone.
So I like it. We have come to the word freedom 5 or 6 times by now. So it's a good theme evolving out of our discussion. I'll take some more questions here quickly in the last 4-5 minutes. We had a question from Randy, which says here, I'm very interested in return on work and learning how it can be applied to a membership organization like Amcham, Sweden. Delivering value to our nearly 200 member companies is paramount. So how does a member organization adopt the return on work concept?
Just reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to discuss it. I think that this is going to be a little bit different in different types of organizations, how you deal with that. So I can't give you like a generic answer because it would become too generic. So I'd say, just reach out to me on LinkedIn, and happy to discuss it.
Brilliant. Randy, please reach out to Alok on LinkedIn. Great opportunity to start a discussion. Maria here is asking, are the big platforms the only solution for gig workers? Could there not be an opportunity to create smaller entrepreneurial gig teams that have their own gig software and work in a local context instead of Foodora?
Yes.
Yeah.
Actually, like, this is okay. Now I'm going to become a little bit meta here, so hold on to your horses. But I mean, there's like a, I mean, it's starting to get layered, right? There's almost like a gigification of the platforms themselves. So if you go into appipie.com, I mean, you can in a couple of hours build without coding a competitor to Foodora, or like a food delivery business, right? So, or if you go on Fiverr, I mean, you can buy a software. So absolutely, I mean, there's a lot of small platforms that are coming up. It's not only the big ones. I mean, if anything, there's consolidation where the big ones buy the small ones and so on. So, and just look at the scooter sharing market. I mean, there's like a new one every week here in Stockholm. So I think that I definitely see that increasing. It was a little bit unclear 4 or 5 years ago where that would go, but I think that actually that transaction cost, the transaction cost of starting a company, starting a gig platform, is also reducing and decreasing.
Okay.
You don't need $10 million for it anymore.
So if we take that to your Appjobs, do you like at what scale you decide you are ready to work with a platform? Like, do you have certain guidelines? It needs to be global or regional, or how do you decide?
On Appjobs.com, we work with everyone who wants to work with us. On Appjobs work, there's quite a lot of tech work involved, so we try to go from the biggest first, and then down. And similar thing with Unveil. But that has more to do with like resource scarcity, that we have to conserve our resources.
Excellent. Alok, I'd like to offer a big thank you to you from Startup Grind community for being here, talking to us and to our amazing audience. And this interview will be, your fireside chat will be available digitally on Startup Grind Global Community. We'll share the link. Thank you so much for today. If there are any questions that you have, you can reach out to me, reach out to Alok, and ask. We are always here to help out.